I am Levwood. My pronouns are he and him. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. As we begin our service, I invite you, if you're in person, to silence your phone. If you're at home, to close your other windows. Take a deep breath and center yourself for worship. We open in welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land, who live on in their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Patawomic Indian Tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move toward healing, so that all together shall one day know full justice. We turn to worship, to cast out our fears in this month as we begin exploring courage. Our opening music invites us to think about forgiveness and the courage that it takes to forgive. We won't say a whole lot about forgiveness. It will come up again a little bit later in the service, but I wanted to acknowledge that this is, in the Jewish tradition, the time of Yamim Noraim, the days of awe between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when Jews are encouraged, and I think it's an interesting practice you could take up yourself, to go and ask forgiveness of anyone that you feel that you've wronged this year, in those 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So just wanted to lift that up and point out that it requires courage. So we will be exploring courage this month. We're going to do similar to last month. We're going to start in our everyday lives, and then we're going to zoom out a little bit next week for National Coming Out Day and Indigenous Peoples Day Sunday, and look at it in more of our local and communal and historical context. And then we'll zoom out 2 Sundays after that and look at kind of the theological roots of courage and how that connects to hope. But today, when we look at courage in our everyday lives, we're actually going to explore some philosophical underpinnings of courage in Western civilization. The way that courage is not just an individual act, but a collective act. And we're going to connect it back to belonging. Last month, exactly a month ago, we talked about what belonging asks of us. And it asks us to be courageous enough to be authentic and to be accepting of others so that they feel comfortable being authentic. So there's a way that belonging makes courage possible, and courage makes belonging possible. So we'll look at that today.
Our chalice lighting, Courage Is, by Reverend David Breeden. We gather together here, now, summoning our courage to be. We gather, bringing our weariness and our energy. We gather, bringing our wariness and our visions. Like trees in rocky places, our roots clutch. What we find is each other. What we find is each other holding tightly. Courage is not certitude. Courage is not assurance. Courage is the willingness to join in the attempt, to join in the unlikely, even the impossible. Courage is a choice. Courage is a way of knowing. Courage is a way of joining together. Courage is knowing that together we will do what none of us can do alone. Welcome to Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. I am Nancy Melito. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm happy to be your worship associate today. This congregation is a welcoming and inclusive community that seeks to create a more just and compassionate world. If you are new to Accotink and would like to talk more about this church, just about anyone here can tell you about us. Our greeters, our minister, myself, or anyone with a cross-stitch name tag. After you're here a while, you get a cross-stitch name tag. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, we encourage you to stay for our social hour, online and in person, immediately after this service. We're so delighted that you decided to join us today. Welcome. Our reading today is an excerpt from When the Hero is the Problem by Rebecca Solnit. For an embodiment of the word single-handed, you might turn to the heroine of the recent movie Woman at War. It's about an Icelandic eco-saboteur who blows up rural power lines and hides in scenic spots from helicopters hunting her, and is pretty good with a bow and arrow. But the most famous and effective eco-sabotage in the island's history was not single-handed. In a farming valley on the Laxá River in northern Iceland, on August 25th, 1970, community members blew up a dam to protect farmland from being flooded. After the dam was dynamited, more than 100 farmers claimed credit or responsibility. There were no arrests, and there was no dam. And there were some very positive consequences, including protection of the immediate region and new Icelandic environmental regulations and awareness. It's almost the only story I know of environmental sabotage having a significant impact, and it may be because it expressed the will of the many, not the few. We are not very good at telling stories about 100 people doing things, or considering that the qualities that matter in saving a valley or changing a world are mostly not physical courage and violent clashes, but the ability to coordinate and inspire and connect with lots of other people and create stories about what could be and how we get there.
So I just want to make it clear, I'm not telling you to commit eco-sabotage as a community, although I'm not telling you not to either. We'll come back to that story a little bit later. I want to begin by talking about virtue ethics. So Aristotle defines a virtue as a mean, a middle, between two vices. And he uses the example of anger, which I think is a great one to start with because we may or may not see anger as a virtue to begin with. And actually, in much of his writings, Aristotle doesn't see anger as a virtue, but he does say that it can be virtuous if a person is angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, with the right purpose, and in the right way. So the virtue is in response to the consequence, to the situation, to the context, the situation, and even something like anger, which we might see as a vice, sometimes can be a virtue if it's done in the right context, with the right person, to the right degree, etc. So another example that's often given to explain virtue ethics and to define virtue is courage, which is our theme for this month. Courage being the mean or the middle ground between cowardice and recklessness or foolhardiness. And often I've heard the example given of running into a burning building. So for myself, to run into a burning building, perhaps because I want to save someone, right? It's a reasonable desire, but it would probably be foolhardy and reckless of me to do so. I don't know how to fight the fire or how to keep myself safe. That would be reckless, not courageous. But for a firefighter who shows up to fight that fire, to not go into that burning building, that would be cowardice. And in between recklessness and cowardice is courage. Now, Buddhism also adds another layer to this when they talk about virtues, not about courage to my knowledge specifically, but let's apply it to courage. They suggest that every virtue has a far enemy, which is the opposite of the virtue, and a near enemy, which mimics the virtue. So let's look at that with courage. So the far enemy of courage is cowardice, right? It's the complete opposite. It's giving in to our fear. But the near enemy is that recklessness. It could look like courage for me to run into that burning building, even if there's no chance that I'm going to come out, even if I'm sacrificing my life and so there's no wisdom to it. It's not helping anyone, right? You could even imagine if you might call it courageous if my child was in there, right? But if I had more than one child and I recklessly ran into that building, you would no longer call it courageous, right? You would call it reckless because I left my other children now without a parent. So we've defined virtue now. We've looked at Aristotle's definition of it and applied it to courage, which is what we're going to talk about, but it applies to other virtues in general. Okay, so it's that middle ground between two extremes, or even two vices, is where we find virtue. But I want to say, who cares? I mean, what good does it does it do us to know what a virtue is, to know what courage is? How does that tell us what makes courage possible? How to embody and enact courage? So I'm going to go back to our Western philosophical tradition, and it has a simple recipe for how to enact courage and other virtues, which is to use wisdom and willpower. Yeah, can you see how that works? So you use wisdom to determine that space between the two vices and decide whether you're going to take the courageous act or whether it's reckless or cowardly not to. And then you use your willpower to overcome whatever fear you have, right? Even if you're a firefighter, it's dangerous and scary to run into a burning building. And so you use your willpower to encourage yourself to do that. But this I still don't find fully satisfying for what makes courage possible, for answering that question, because willpower, we know, is a muscle, right? We can build our willpower, but just like any muscle, it can wear out, right? If you're using a lot of willpower over a long period of time, you're going to get tired, and then willpower is not going to keep you from engaging in whatever vice it is that you're trying to use willpower not to engage in. And also, human beings are pretty irrational creatures. We're not that wise. We have irrational fears. You could say that the child's fear of school is not that rational, but it was a real fear that the child had to grapple with. So what makes courage possible? So one thing that can help us make courage possible, it's not willpower exactly, but we can train ourselves to have more ability to do difficult things, which we could say is what courage is more broadly. It's not just fearful things, but difficult things. Stepping into discomfort takes courage. So one thing that cognitive science is teaching us that helps with this is moving towards pain, moving towards discomfort. And the reason for this is that our neurotransmitters for pleasure and pain, for comfort and discomfort, are designed for homeostasis. They're designed to seek out balance. So if you are always going towards pleasure, guess what happens? If you're always going towards comfort, guess what happens? Your pleasure receptor dulls, so that you actually get less pleasure over time when you're consistently seeking pleasure. Does that make sense? It doesn't want to go up like this, so as it goes up, it damps it down to get you back to even. It's kind of a bummer, right? But here's the good news. It works on the other side of the seesaw as well. So if you move towards pain or difficult things, it dulls your pain receptors, and it increases the sensitivity of your pleasure receptors. So then, if you've moved into a space of moving towards a difficulty, and you have a small pleasure, it's going to feel more pleasurable. So we want to move towards the discomfort. When we move only towards pleasure and comfort, then our depression levels and our anxiety levels rise because our neurotransmitters are trying to adjust. And we're freaked out because now the thing that was giving us pleasure isn't working anymore, the thing that was giving us comfort. So we need to train ourselves by moving towards that discomfort. But there's another aspect of what makes courage possible that leaves out. So I want us to look back at the example of the firefighter. What makes it possible for the firefighter to be courageous? The firefighter has training. They have the proper equipment, right? Fire-resistant suit that they wear. And there's infrastructure. There's fire hydrants and fire trucks and the hoses that you attach to the fire hydrant to fight the fire. All of that is in place so that it's less dangerous, and therefore the firefighter can be courageous and fight the fire. This is what makes courage possible. So let's break that down a little bit more. In every one of these examples, that individual firefighter who's running into the burning building is dependent on a lot of other people. Dependent on the generations of firefighters who came before, who figured out how to fight fires and how to train yourself to fight a fire. Dependent on the scientists and the manufacturers who made the fire-resistant gear that they wear. Dependent on the politicians and us encouraging our politicians and our taxpayer dollars so that you have the infrastructure, that you have a fire department, and that you have the fire hydrant to fight the fire, right? Without any of these collective actions, that firefighter would be foolhardy to run into the fire, just like I would be foolhardy. So this collective action is what makes courage possible. And that's not only true with fighting fires, it's true in all the ways that we can imagine being courageous. We have a tendency to imagine courage as an individual act of heroism, but it rarely, if ever, is. Think about our reading and that story that we tell and that is told in blockbuster movie after blockbuster movie, that fictional story of a lone hero courageously standing up against some other force, often with using violence as their primary tool, just like that protagonist in the Icelandic movie, Woman at War. And meanwhile, raise your hand if you knew about that story, about the 100 farmers in Iceland who blew up that dam that led to new regulations where no one went to jail. Anybody know? No, we don't tell that story of the collective action, the collective courageous action that actually makes change, that actually works. Rebecca Solnit, in that same essay, says this: "We like our lone and exceptional heroes and the drama of violence and the virtue of muscle, or at least that's what we get over and over. And in the course of getting them, we don't get much of a picture of how change happens and what our role in it might be, or how ordinary people matter." She continues, "Positive social change results mostly from connecting more deeply to the people around you rather than rising above them." I'm going to say that again. Positive change results mostly from connecting more deeply to the people around you rather than heroically rising above them. It comes from coordinated actions, not solo actions. She says, among the virtues that matter are those traditionally considered feminine rather than masculine, more nerd than jock. Listening, respect, patience, negotiation, strategic planning, storytelling. Those farmers had a lot of meetings, y'all. A lot of probably boring, committee-type meetings to plan that action, to work through their differences, and come to a decision to take that action. So what makes courage possible most often is not even our own wisdom or willpower. It's many people coming together, joining together in collective action to make possible the context for courage. Training firefighters, providing them with the right gear and the right infrastructure. This is what makes courage possible, this interdependence with other human beings. And it's true in all aspects of our life. You see it in the story, how the parent supports the child, accepting their fear and affirming their worth. And sometimes we get our courage, that support, that collective interdependence that makes us courageous, comes even not from other humans. Remember, when the child hears the parent say, "You're different," the child is not comforted by that in the story. They actually feel a little bit worse. They don't want to be different. Doesn't see it as a good thing to be different until they go out on their own, in their own reflection, notice that clouds are different, cats are different, and those blue flowers are so beautiful. Those few blue flowers surrounded by abundance of yellow flowers. And they identify with that blue flower. And then, through the support they got from the parent and from the wider world, from nature, they are able to be courageous and to love themselves. This is what makes courage possible. So, we can train ourselves and our neurotransmitters to move towards discomfort, which will increase our experience of pleasure and make us more likely to able to do uncomfortable things, more able to be courageous. And collective action creates the context that makes courage possible. But let's put these two things together a little bit, our individual things we can do to be courageous and the collective, by looking at belonging. That child in the story has a sense of belonging that encourages, think about that word, encourage, instills courage in, that encourages the child to be courageous, to be brave. Belonging makes courage possible. But belonging, if you remember from a month ago, also calls us to be courageous enough to share our true, authentic selves. So these two things go together. And because of that, it's important to both be courageous and share your authentic self, because you're not going to experience belonging otherwise. That's what belonging asks of us. But also for us as a community to be that parent, to create that community of acceptance and affirmation for each other when we share our authentic selves, even if we disagree, right? Even if we see things really differently. And we talked about that Hebrew letter bet and the wisdom of Brene Brown. So let's revisit that, because the bet of belonging is also the bet of bravery. We need that strong back, that soft front, and that wild heart to belong and to be brave. Because when we have that strong back, we can keep our cool in those challenging moments in life, in those difficult conversations, or when we're trying to break a bad habit. We can have that mountain of stability. If we have that soft front, then we stay soft and open to what other people are bringing to the situation. Even if it feels threatening, we've got that strong back, We lean into that to calm ourselves, and we open softly with that fresh flowerness and that ability to reflect what they're sharing back to them and see the validity and the usefulness of that. And with that wild heart that is open, that's more than black and white thinking, but sees the complexity of the situation, and so stays in the game, stays engaged when things are hard. So that bet of belonging is also the bet of bravery, and it creates a spiral, right? Where the bravery creates more belonging, the belonging creates more bravery in an upward spiral. Or, if you don't put yourself out there, if the community you're in is not accepting of you, then that creates a downward spiral of disconnection and despair. So we want to have that bet of bravery and belonging, that strong back, soft front, wild heart, in order to create that spiral of belonging and bravery. So just to review, courage and all virtues are contextual. They're a middle ground between two vices. With courage, that's between cowardice and recklessness. Courage calls us to move towards the hard things because that changes our brain chemistry, balancing our pleasure and pain, our comfort and discomfort seesaw, making courageous action more possible. And courage and belonging go together and create this upward spiral of connection and courage. I'll close with these words from Rebecca Solnit, who reminds us that our largest problems won't be solved by heroes. They'll be solved, if they are, by movements, coalitions, civil society. The climate movement, she reminds us as an example, has been first of all a mass effort. And if figures like Bill McKibben stand out, she writes, well, he stands out as the co-founder of a global climate action group whose network reaches into 188 countries. He stands out as the guy who keeps saying some version of the most effective thing you can do as an individual about climate is to stop being an individual. Because what makes courage possible is all of us working together, all of us together making a space of belonging and connection and care that encourages daring, bravery, creativity, and bold action, bold collective action. May it be so, and may we be among those who make it so. Amen, 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 and blessed be.
Though we will extinguish our chalice flame, we carry within us what we kindled. The light of inspiration, the warmth of compassion, the fire of commitment. May we bring these gifts into our lives and share them radiantly out into the world. And now, if you would please stand. We cannot hold hands just yet, but please stretch your hands out to your fellow Accotinkers, and if you are online at home, stretch your hands out to the screen as we join hands virtually and recite the words of David Bumbaugh. This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time, death, and the space between the stars. We pause now in silent witness to that unity.
You may be seated. I just want to leave us with this sense that it's those everyday actions that we don't normally think of as heroic, but are heroic. Nurturing a child, listening and supporting someone in this congregation or in your larger community that's going through a tough time, learning the concerns of your neighbors in the wider community, especially those most impacted by injustice, as we can do through our participation with voice, both through giving money this month through our outreach collection and also through showing up as members of Voice at actions like on December 4th. It's through that collective action that we make, those small actions all put together, that we make courage possible and we make change and transformation possible.